So, last year I started doing something a bit different with my top games of 2022, in that I specifically focused on 5 games that I actually had played on the channel that year. And I'll be honest, that's not an easy thing to do again. This was a bit of a weird year, full of more nostalgia and older titles that wouldn't be out of place on some sort of retro celebration channel. NFL Street, Pikmin, Mario Party 1, even Pokemon White, the main event of this past year, is just, yeah, it's a great game, but you knew that already. So that leaves, let's see, Spirit of the North, Rime, Uncharted The Lost Legacy, Shadow of the Tomb Raider, and Horizon Forbidden West, again, which was already on last year's list. I can't do that. I can't count up from 5 games and try to spin praises about every single one like I'm some budget journalist again. Not this year. 2023 had a lot of good games come out, sure, but that's for different YouTubers to discuss. That's not me. I don't talk the game industry anymore because I hate the fucking game industry. The large swath of layoffs as games continue to break sales records, as games like Baldur's Gate 3 make a laughingstock of the industry as a whole. These clowns in suits at the top that add to the ever-growing pile of named individuals who are destroying the fabric of society as we know it at a sheer greed at record-breaking speeds, as their window of opportunity continues to shrink, compounded only by their own decisions so dense and moronic that their qualification as sentient beings rather than artificial constructs designed to make the world into a worse place for the rest of us is continually called into question. Developers are great. I love developers, but fuck these monsters. They deserve nothing. Anyway, Sea of Stars and Tears of the Kingdom are like my game of the year 1 and 2. I genuinely cannot decide between them because I love them both a lot for very different reasons. Reasons that will be explained in their own Let's Plays someday. I promise. No, let's do something else. Let's just look back on this weird year and recap everything at lightning speed this time. How does that sound? Now, that said, there is a lot, so this is still going to be a relatively long video. We'll just go one by one. Ready? Go. Subnautica Below Zero is Baby's first Subnautica game. It misses a lot of what makes the original great, but works as a good experience for easing in more squeamish and nervous players who are intimidated by the first game's mystery, atmosphere, and seemingly horror-esque elements. I recommend it to the more faint of heart as a jumping-off point, even if it is only half the game that its predecessor is. But as a sequel, I do consider it a failure. Can't wait for Subnautica 3, though. The Iki Island DLC of Ghost of Tsushima is a bit more than just more Ghost of Tsushima, but not much more than a bit, if that makes sense. It's a good addition to the package, and in a game where the combat itself is the greatest strength that carries players through the game, more of that is never a bad thing. But apart from a couple of interesting and different takes on what had been up to that point repeatable ad nauseum side content, and an even weaker story that isn't given nearly enough time to amount to anything meaningful, I can't say it adds much more for me to want to go back and play it. I think in this case, the main game is more than enough, long as it is. Deadly Creatures is a very silly game. That's definitely a lot of fun in concept. It's just too bad its controls are worse than death, but that's an obscure Wii game for you. Journey to the Savage Planet offers a nice subversion to the usual explorative sci-fi formula in that it is mainly about solving puzzles, but the humor is absolutely trying way too hard at times, and it can be far more annoying than it is endearing. Again, at times. NFL Street still mostly holds up as a shiny example of how to make sports games fun for people who don't like sports games. It's overly animated, campy as all hell, and totally self-aware. It's a huge shame that publishers no longer believe games like this can exist, and no, I'm not even talking in the how do you do fellow kids way of something like Riders Republic or Steep. This is a game that uses caricatures of real, actual players, and from then on it just kinda doesn't care, and I like games that don't care. I am reminded of how insanely bad developers were at programming artificial difficulty back then, however, and I don't miss it. Space Invaders, but, well, more specifically, this version of Space Invaders is an excellent take on the classic that I still think holds up to this day. It's simple, it's quick, it's short, and it shakes things up enough to still be well and truly fun nearly 25 years after this iteration came out. Expect to see more of this game on the channel in the future. Kingdoms of Amalur seems quite a bit ahead of its time in combining CRPG elements with looter-shooter mechanics. It's engaging, rewarding, and actually has a lot of depth to it that separates it from most of its contemporaries. It's just too bad that Kurt Schilling is a massive piece of shit. Mafia is, well, it's barely a game. It's more of an interactive cinematic experience, and there's nothing wrong with that. It just makes it hard to discuss here when 95% of what you're doing is driving a car from place to place and watching a cutscene. I do like me some good mafioso fiction, however. 007 Nightfire is a game I know a lot of people grew up with and like very, very much, so I will not say anything mean about it at all. Spirit of the North is something I very much wanted to like, but it also demonstrates a fine line in what I think makes and breaks visually expressive indie games about walking around and solving puzzles. I've gone on record saying I absolutely adore Journey and Abzu and games that are like that. Hell, I'll even praise Rime a bit later. But Spirit of the North kind of feels like it's more so ticking boxes than anything else. It has nice piano music and alright visuals, and it tries to do all of its storytelling without even a thimbleful of text. But it's also lacking in any actual substance. It's only head and shoulders above asset flip games because it isn't incompetently made, but it isn't particularly useful either. It's just kind of inoffensive, and I think that's a fine game for something that's like $5 or $10, but this game wants $20 or even $25 depending on your platform, and I think that's just too much of an ask. Amazing Island is exactly the kind of game that I and my cousins would have thought looked like the coolest shit ever when choosing out our nightly game that we were all going to play together late into the night after watching a movie, only to find out that it's very much not at all what we were expecting. 3 out of 4 of us get really bored, and the 4th continues to play it all by his lonesome out of sheer stubbornness because he can't admit to himself or anyone else that what we wasted our free rental on is kind of a shit video game. I miss those days. Wario World is... Okay, look, I know a lot of people also love this game, although probably considerably less people than 007 Nightfire, so I won't be mean to it. I just think it's thoroughly, almost painfully mediocre. Uncharted: The Lost Legacy is like one of the biggest breaths of fresh air I've had from a AAA game in a very long time. I mean, like, did you know that you can make a really fun game that looks high budget and plays amazingly well and does all of the things that AAA games do, but it can also be under 10 hours and still be fun? I know, right? Sue me, I like this one. Probably even more than Drake's Fortune, honestly. And also maybe more than the 4th one, please don't kill me. SpongeBob SquarePants Battle for Bikini Bottom Rehydrated is not a very good game. I find this funny because I very much remember the original version on the GameCube, as well as the movie tie-in game, and they were quite excellent in my mind. And after I played this remake, I went back to those games. They're better by like a lot. There's so much about this remake that just feels off. From the platforming to the presentation to the voiceover and everything in between. Sure, it looks better in a still image, but it plays atrociously, and I can barely put my finger on why. The controls feel more slippery and inconsistent, every character and item feels more floating and weightless, and it's funny because I've heard old Spyro fans say the same thing about the Reignited trilogy, as well as Crash fans about the Insane trilogy. And it's funny because I don't have a frame of reference for the originals for those respective series, and yet I think the remakes play amazingly well, but I do have a frame of reference for this SpongeBob game, and it just doesn't feel right. To me, anyway. I don't like it. Ugh. The Talos Principle is a very bizarre game, but it's one of those games where clearly the narrative is opening up into something greater, and I appreciate games that do that. The problem is, and while this game is nowhere near as egregious as something like The Witness, I still don't much care for games that do the one puzzle challenge that progressively gets harder the entire time in order to subvert your expectations along the way and build towards something supposedly bigger and better. While it's certainly engaging, I'm too ADHD for this stuff, man. Shadow Warrior is a game I remember liking a lot for being campy, silly, and over the top, but that was back when it came out in 2013. Now that I have since played the likes of Wolfenstein: The New Order and Doom 2016, I no longer care about Shadow Warrior 2013. Rime is honestly everything that I wanted it to be, although I did have fairly middling expectations for it. That's not to say it's a bad game, because it's actually a lovely little adventure that I would put right up there with the likes of games like Limbo and Brothers: A Tale of Two Sons, although I do think both of those games are a smidge better. Rime is just simple and sweet. And for a game that went through as much development turmoil as it did, more than anything, I'm just surprised it never gets talked about much. I suppose it sort of missed that early indie walking sim puzzle adventure craze of the early 2010s by a few years, but it's still a good one. Cubivore is one of those games that's just weird for the sake of being weird. I know the PS2 and GameCube had a metric ton of these sorts of games, but where I find value in these games is when one actually turns out to be interesting or fun, like Tulip, or Ribbit King, or Gitaroo Man. These are very good games. Cubivore is not a very good game. It's not a bad game either, it's just there, I suppose. Duck Dodgers, starring Daffy Duck, is 100% another game I would have rented as a child, except my parents picked this one and not me. But at an age where I couldn't tell whether or not a game is good or bad, only that it was new, and it's the only game I had that was new, and therefore I had to beat it. Honestly though, it really is alright. Like, I've played many, many worse 3D platformers on the Nintendo 64 than this one. It's just sort of okay, and not worth its price tag at all. Daikatana is, well, non-functional, and these kinds of games are so much more fun if you're trying to riff on them in an AVGN rip-off style format with interlaced letterbox footage in a late 2000s YouTube video. That's not what this is, so I'm just gonna move on. Haunting Ground is a very novel and unique idea for a horror game. I was immediately on board with the idea the moment I realized it's the sort of game where the protagonist can't even defend herself. It stands out, and the environments still hold up all these years later, as did a lot of early to mid 2000s horror games that use procedurally generated graphics. Hello, Resident Evil Remake. The main mechanic is something I didn't actually manage to show in the video, however, as it isn't truly unlocked until well after an hour into the game. But it is interesting, and I like interesting things. Blood Will Tell has no right being as fun as it is, and there's a reason why it was one of my longest videos this year. I just kinda didn't want to stop, but eventually forced myself to. It's so bizarre, so campy, so over the top, and so jank, and yet it's all of these things in the best way possible. It actually controls very well and responds to inputs nicely for such a convoluted structure and control scheme. It's just quintessentially oddball PS2, but these are the kinds of games I'm really looking for when I delve into the untapped waters of weird and obscure video games. Starshot Space Circus Fever is a worse game than Duck Dodgers. It's another one of those N64 games where a studio just kind of threw an idea at a wall and hoped it would work, and man, I gotta say, it ain't no Glover. And Glover ain't even all that. Aero Fighters is just another in a long line of awesome top-down shmups on the SNES, but that's really all I can say about it because it does so much of what a lot of those games do. What I didn't know is that it's actually horribly short, even by Super Nintendo shmup standards. So while it plays well and is fun in short bursts, those bursts are very, very short. Pokemon Black and White is, without a doubt, the best game in the entire Pokemon franchise, and I mean that sincerely. I know everyone has their preferences and will argue differently from me. Some Gen 5 truthers might even say I'm wrong because the sequel is even better, but I respectfully disagree. Black and White are the complete package, doing everything that Pokemon does best, at its best, and taking the things that Pokemon was never all that good at and doing the best we've ever seen with those things. The visuals are still incredible, and I will never tire of the game's sprite quality. The soundtrack is one of my all-time favorites with so many awesome and memorable tracks. Unova as a region is pretty damn great, lively and robust as it is, even if it isn't the most varied. The story here is the best that Game Freak has ever done before or since, and while that isn't saying much, it actually creates and fleshes out characters, and multiple ones at that. It's a plot worth latching onto, and its writing is genuinely excellent at times. Pokemon games always fall into the trap of, and I mean, this is something that dates back to Generation 1, really, it's the fact that they're Pokemon games. Games for fans of Pokemon. Games that people who like Pokemon should like, and while that is a considerable number of people, Pokemon fans are easily pleased, and more than they care to admit. Hi, it's me, I'm a Pokemon fan. Pokemon Black and White are genuinely good RPGs that stand on their own. If the rest of the series was stricken from existence and this game was asked to represent all that Pokemon is from here and into the annals of history, it would do a fantastic job of it. It would be celebrated as an RPG classic right up there with the likes of Final Fantasy VII, Secret of Mana, and Chrono Trigger. It's the one with the silly monsters instead. In and out of context, Pokemon Black and White is as close to a masterpiece as this franchise gets, and barring wider discussion about the series as a whole, and many other topics I could touch upon if this were a video all about this game, I really do think it's one of the greatest video games of all time. And yes, spoiler alert, of all the games that we played on the channel this year, this one is my favorite. Mario Party 1 is a game made for sadists by sadists. It's also just not very well designed. I mean, the minigames are good and the core is there, but you can clearly tell Hudson Soft kinda just had the basics down here. It's actually the one Mario Party game I think was designed with extremely long games of 50 or so turns in mind, as otherwise these boards result in relatively low scoring affairs that rely almost entirely on bonus stars to pick a winner. It's also just the cruelest Mario Party, even if that is anecdotal, or maybe I'm saying, I don't know, you tell me. Pikmin is a pretty damn good video game, alright? I do like it. I wish it were a more tightly polished experience, and I have heard that the Switch version is in fact that, but that is my one serious gripe with this game, and I do find that a bit rich that this game is as broken as it is when it's made by Mr. A Rush Game is Forever Bad himself, Shigeru Miyamoto. I mean, or is it Gabe Newell who said that? Michael Scott? Wayne Gretzky? I don't know. Point is, it's silly because this is otherwise one of the most fun games I've ever played and can definitely say I also suck at it. Like, really, really badly. And I'm usually the kind of piss baby that hates every video game that I'm bad at. No, not really. I'm kidding, obviously. But it is very telling when a game is easy to love in spite of the fact that you, well, suck at it. Shadow the Tomb Raider is not a very good game at all. In a response to criticism that the first two games in the Survivor trilogy were just Girl Uncharted with too much action and not enough tomb raiding, it feels like Crystal Dynamics stripped the series down to its barest essentials here, doing everything right on paper but very little in execution. They turned this version of Lara, who was always walking that fine line of capable and confident, yet way in over her head and still managing to survive to an unbelievable degree, into an absolute piece of fucking wood. They also used her lovable co-star, who had played the foil to Lara in the last game, a lot more this time around to raise the stakes, and all but turned him into a piece of wood as well. The settings are gorgeous, and the puzzle solving is okay sometimes. It still has much of the same gameplay that the first two games had and a lot of the same mechanics, but it's just going through the motions. There's such a lack of soul here that everything feels designed by committee. The first two games were insanely over the top, but at least one of them really tried to be taken seriously, and the other game said, fuck it, we're over the top and campy now, and they earned it. Rise was a hilariously unrealistic game in how insane the scenarios could get, to the point where it looped back around to being an absolute blast again. Shadow the Tomb Raider has these things, and yet it just feels so lifeless, hollow, sad, and like this desiccated husk. I see why the series has been on pause ever since. It's just so much more of a step back than I ever imagined it could be. The Messenger is a game I don't want to talk much about right now. We'll save that one for later. Star Wars Racer Revenge is a terrible racing game, but it has a fun gimmick that I quite like. If it were only about trying to get first place, I would hate it. But it's not. It's a silly racing game doing the silly thing that Burnout does, but with pod racers, and that's neat. Although I wish it had takedown cams like Burnout does. That said, it is a bit too clunky for my liking, and feels like one of those games I really would have enjoyed had I grown up with it, but as a cynical adult, I would say that it's not as good as the other pod racing game, which I did grow up with and have a predisposed bias towards. Paradise Killer is the one game on this list that I have played so little of that I can't confidently say anything about it. It has those quirky vibes that are so off the charts weird that it almost annoys me a bit, but I know that sort of humor works for a lot of people, so I'm not gonna knock it for that. It's just not for me. Returnal is a very good, very challenging, very in-depth, and very enjoyable video game. It combines so many elements of what I love about video games and makes them work in exactly the way I like, with tons of replayability due to its roguelike elements, while also not relying too much on many of the annoying tropes found in your average roguelike. I love shooters, I love bullet hells, I love looter games, and I love exploration, and especially in oppressively bleak environments. This game just ticks all of those boxes. Dokapon Kingdom is somehow even more sadistic than Mario Party, and I'm not even kidding. For such a clever idea, this game is absolutely evil, and what makes it so much worse is that the default Dokapon experience takes hours to complete. I absolutely love the idea of a board game with RPG elements, but man, are there way too many ways to prolong this experience, which I really think takes it into frustrating territory. I also just most definitely suck at this one. Jet: The Far Shore is one of those indies that's a bit too niche and weird for me to truly grasp onto it, with a core mechanic that's not nearly compelling enough to carry me along. Piloting a ship is a fine core mechanic, but you gotta make it interesting. Make it difficult via constantly changing terrain, or make it fast-paced and energetic. If we could take the gameplay of XO1 and stuff it into this game's storytelling, we really could have something here. And the winner for the most fun I had with a game in my variety series this year goes to A Short Hike. I just love it. The contained space, the little story, the writing, the way characters behave, the simple act of moving around this tiny world, all the little collectibles and side activities, the entire thing can be experienced in under 4 hours, and it is just delightful in every single way. More games like this, please. More, I beg you. Chibi Robo Plug Into Adventure is another one of those weird games I was talking about when discussing Cubivore, except it's actually really good, and sweet, and charming. Is it perfect? No, I don't think so. There's a bit too much trial and error with certain things in a game that is very much about pressuring you to get things done in a small amount of time, not too dissimilar from Pikmin in that regard, although Chibi Robo is just a tad less of a strategy game and more about exploring the big, wide world of the house you're in. I totally understand why this game is a cult classic, because it's doing the quirky, funny, silly thing, but like actually well. This is another game you may see more of in the future on this channel, so keep your eyes peeled. Cloudpunk is a busy work game. It's simple in execution, it plays just alright, and if I were playing it normally, plugged into its audio logs and listening to it the whole way, I couldn't last more than an hour. Give me a podcast and a bowl of snacks in front of me, however, and suddenly this game could last me a whole Saturday. It's one of those kind of games, and it does that just fine. I think these sorts of games are great, and there's never enough of them. I just think this one doesn't particularly stand out beyond its witty dark humor, which, I mean, I really do like witty dark humor. As a piece of actual tangible gameplay, however, I think I still prefer something like Power Wash Simulator. Teen Titans is a pretty cheap beat-em-up that does a good job of showcasing what the average licensed game was like back then. Now, this is at a time where licensed games were generally alright to simply bad at worst. Not the god-awful, unforgivable drivel that would come out later with the advent of mobile stores and flash games. So it's okay, it's just very surface level, and it's based on an awesome property, because that show fucking ruled, and what was done to it was and still is one of the cruelest injustices a good TV show has ever gotten. But I really wouldn't recommend seeking the game out, especially not at that price on the Xbox version. Are you kidding me? Call of the Sea is just nice, and I like nice games. I like games that give me the warm and the fuzzies while racking my brain a little bit. I like walking around, opening a journal, and occasionally listening to a good voice actor or actress quip about things. That's all Call of the Sea is, and it's lovely for it. A bit esoteric at times, suffering from some of the same issues most point-and-click adventure games are often criticized for, but just a nice time nonetheless. Star Wars Republic Commando is another one of those games that I would have loved had I played it as a kid. I would have spent months of my life mastering every single level in that game down to the encounter, memorizing strategies and enemy spawns and tearing my way through it much the same way I had many other shooters from that time period. As a grown adult with barely functioning opposable thumbs, far less affinity with early 2000s shooters, and just a whole lot of time in hindsight and no predisposed biases, this game's just okay. And I kind of suck at it. My only true complaint is that it just never stops talking. From the comms chatter to the chatter from enemies and the mission objective and all of the sound effects, it's almost an overload of stimulation that had me exhausted with it pretty darn quickly. Kuon is another interesting and weird horror game with a very cool setting that is nowhere near as good as something like Haunting Ground. This game just isn't very well put together. It seems to mimic a lot of what successful horror games were doing at the time without really understanding why those things work. It can't maintain a constantly tense and oppressive atmosphere when it's spending more time just not being boring. And the juxtaposition between camp and seriousness is too jarring for this to work, in my opinion anyway. It's no wonder the game was reviewed so poorly back when it came out. And, yeah. For the sake of spoilers, I didn't say anything about Poke Park 2. I mean, that's more of a 2024 Let's Play than it is for this year, given how new the series still is. Destiny, it's its own rabbit hole I'll be going down at a very different time, and like I said, this year needed more recapping than it did defining. 2023 was a strange one, defined more by, I think, what went wrong and me finally solidifying the way I want to do things on this channel. Hopefully that rundown was entertaining enough. I won't promise this is how it's going to go next year, but there's still time for me to come up with something entirely different. Thank you all so very much for watching, and I will see you all in the next one.